Today we're talking a little bit about a recent tournament controversy around top players deliberately not scoring points to try and get an easier ride to the top. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I just wanted to talk about a little situation that's been happening in tournaments that I genuinely found really quite interesting, and it seems to have split opinions within the community quite a bit. The competitive 40k Facebook page has been going a bit mad over the last couple of days, with a very well liked and respected player talking about how it makes sense in a big tournament to deliberately try and throw away a few points towards the end of the game, provided you're happy that you're going to win it. It can manipulate your scores a bit to give you a slightly easier run towards the top. I think it's quite rare for there to be any rules against it in any tournament packs, so it certainly isn't cheating unless there are. But generally as a community, people seem to feel that it's very unsporting, and is an unpleasant issue that plagues competitive 40k. I believe the case in point was deliberately moving a few units off objectives so they scored a bit lower. The tournament organiser wound up reprimanding them for it, though it does sound more like it was at their discretion as opposed to actually flouting any rules as far as I understand. To be honest, the actual individual example I don't think is really the interesting bit, but it really shines a spotlight on a practice that I believe is quite common throughout the top tiers of competitive 40k, and what we might be able to do about it. So in the video I'll just give a rough description of how this manipulation works, and a few ideas how we might be able to change events to maybe try and stamp out this weird practice. So here's a rough breakdown of how tournament scoring in Warhammer 40k tends to work. Obviously every tournament is different organisers have different rules, but at least in my experience this tends to be quite a common way. Generally, when everyone has the first round of a tournament, you'll all be assigned randomly. Then largely you're going to have a pool of people who won and a pool of people who lost. Everyone who won a game will go on to play someone who won, and everyone who lost the first game will go on to play someone who lost. From there, you're basically assigned to play people who won or lost the same number of games as you after that. If we look at each bracket though, then within each win bracket, people are assigned to play each other who have the closest score in victory points. So basically, if you had 4 winners, one of them won with 90 points, one with 89, one with 70, and one with 65, then the ones with 90 and 89 would play each other, and the 2 lower scoring players would also be paired up. I think this is often done in tournaments to try and give people as many close games as possible, maybe more for player enjoyment than actually trying to make the most balanced game possible. It's basically another way of trying to make people play a game with someone who's at their level. I think in general the aim for a 40k tournament is to only have one player who's undefeated, though in reality that's not always possible. If the event has too many attendees or not enough rounds, then you're not necessarily going to have one overall winner just by pure wins or losses, and it might come down to victory points. In any case though, it does mean that if you score really well in your first game or two, then your next game is likely to be far harder. If you've near enough maxed out victory points, then it's quite likely that you'll be playing someone else who absolutely dominated their first game. You're a lot less likely to run into someone who maybe really struggle with their first round opponents, and maybe not quite as strong a player as some of the rest. It means that if no one tries to game the system, it means that the biggest winners will typically play the biggest winners quite early on in the event, and it could mean that some of the strongest players around will play each other fairly early. Now of course with that sort of system in place, it means there's quite a big incentive to win the games, but score as low as possible. Say in a really big event you might have 3 or 4 players who have absolutely maxed out their score. If you're one of the other top tier tournament players, it really might be in your interest just to throw a few points away at the end of the game deliberately, and then you won't be playing those people. It just means that you might be playing someone who's a little bit less experienced, and the idea would be to let the big dogs of the tournament scene knock each other out nice and early. If you did this consistently over a fair few games, then your route to the top spot might be far easier than the people on the top tables. If you max 1 every single game that you played, there's a good chance you'll be playing all of the best players in the tournament one after another, where if you threw away a few points, you might have been playing a lot more people who are sort of upper middle table sort of category, and hopefully avoid a few of the biggest and scariest names around. It does create the slightly counterintuitive incentive that if you were winning by a lot towards the end of your game, it might genuinely be in your best interest to move all your troops off their home objectives so they can't score them, and not bother going for any of the further secondaries once you're comfortable that you've won by a large margin. Now, as I said, in most tournaments there aren't any official rules against this, or at least not yet, but generally if a spotlight has ever shone on the issue, a lot of people do see it as controversial and an example of bad sportsmanship, trying to gain an advantage over the other opponents by manipulating your scores, rather than trying to take the more honourable way to the top. In any individual game, it could look a little bit disrespectful to your opponents, particularly if you're clearly winning to the extent where you don't need to even bother scoring any more points. I think for me personally, if I was getting beaten badly, I don't think I'd really personally care too much whether or not they scored 100 or 90 points against me, but I can see how it could be very demoralising to some. I think a lot of people it just feels intrinsically wrong, manipulating the system to gain an advantage, though I think, to be honest, if there's nothing in the rules, it really just exposes a failure in the system to reward the best players trying their hardest. I think everyone would really like to see the best way to win a Warhammer tournament just by playing the games to the best of your ability start to finish, rather than rewarding players who engage in these slightly strange tactics. I would stress though, unless there's any actual rules or guidance about it in events packs, it is most certainly in the realm of sportsmanship, not outright cheating, and again, maybe something that the tournament organisers need to think of beforehand, as opposed to trying to be arbitrary about it after. To be honest though, I think if we're talking potential fixes, I don't think just banning it within the tournament rules is really going to be the easiest way to address it. I mean, some examples could be fairly obvious. Moving your troops off home objectives deliberately to not score, that looks quite clear that you're trying to minimise your score. But for other things, it could be really hard to police indeed. I mean, who's to say if the players just declared their firepower in a fairly suboptimal way, whether that's them really trying to throw the game, or whether they've made some poor generalship decisions. I do think that giving some guidance on it would probably discourage a lot of players, with any kind of punishing the ones who are respecting the rules and rewarding the ones who are able to very easily fly under the radar. I think really if you do want to avoid this sort of gaming, then you just need to change the pairing system in some way. Perhaps the simplest and easiest way might just be to randomise the pairings within each given win or loss bracket. That way there's absolutely no advantage in not scoring as many points as you possibly could, as it might leave you out of pocket at the end of the tournament. I guess the price would be that it would lead to a fair few more unbalanced games, by big winners playing people who only won marginally, and it might create a bit more of a randomising effect in the tournament where you don't get any ultimate winner, and say a fair few are left undefeated by the end. Another option could be something like a highest score plays lowest score within the bracket, so deliberately try and make the games as unbalanced as possible. That could lead to a whole load of lopsided games, but then that would really incentivise getting as many points as you could, as the higher you score, in theory the easier game you get in the next round. Otherwise there might be the potential to use the strength of schedule mechanic in some way. That's a score that keeps track of the strength of the players that you've played through the event, and gives you a score by beating the ones who've wound up finishing better. I must say I'm not the biggest expert on that mechanic, but it does seem like you could use it in a couple of different ways, though apparently it doesn't deal very well with dropouts for any players who start the event but can't finish every game if they do need to go home for whatever reason. So overall, I'll be interested to hear what you have to say down in the comments. Do you feel that deliberately throwing away points is unsportsmanlike, or is it just a failure within the rules of the pairing system and something that should be addressed by the tournament organisers before the game? It seems to be an issue that genuinely divides the community a bit, so I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly try and keep the regular 40k content coming, with new videos out pretty much every day. If you've been liking watching my videos quite a bit, I would just like to mention that the channel also has a Patreon page, and that's one way that you can support if you'd like to. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.